All right, so today I will be talking about When Affirmative Action Was White. It's by Ira Katz-Nielsen. The main argument of the book is examining the systemic racism invoked by policies enacted by the U.S. government to discriminate against African Americans, to put them at social and economic disadvantages, to keep them as second-class citizens, starting from the Jim Crow era up to the Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Affirmative action is positive discrimination. It's policies that favor people who are discriminated against. And Katz-Nielsen's title for the book, When Affirmative Action Was White, is a unique juxtaposition and the irony showing how policies that were enacted prior to the Civil Rights Movement fed white privilege. And while presenting this book, Katz-Nielsen goes through three methods of analysis: historical accounts of white affirmative action, reasonings about race and affirmative action, and finally the approach to policies enacted in the contemporary. The book opens with President Lyndon B. Johnson giving his speech about blacks taking affirmative action for themselves at Howard University. Katz-Nielsen brings up the question, if America had an era of prosperity post-World War II, why exactly did the disparity between white and blacks widen? He states that if President Johnson had taken the time to answer this question while delivering his speech, taking affirmative action for blacks would have had a much more stable foundation. Katz-Nielsen examines the New Deal and the Fair Deal eras and the policies set in place to exclude African Americans from benefiting from the programs. He ties President Johnson's speech to the creation of the programs and how Johnson omitted information regarding his own involvement. Long before Johnson became president after JFK's assassination, Johnson served as a prominent legislator for the House of Representatives, and he served as a master of the Senate. The Democratic South controlled both the houses of Congress, and with Johnson being a Texas state senator, often worked with his southern state constituents to enact policies that promoted white privilege and racial discrimination. I found that Katz-Nielsen's analysis of this information that Johnson omitted highly intriguing, as Johnson could have easily answered the question Katz-Nielsen brought up. Katz-Nielsen focuses on the political landscape of the U.S. government within the houses of Congress, which has been controlled via majority by Southern Democrats whose prerogative was to keep the social organization Jim Crow within the South intact. When writing policies, they used three mechanisms. The first was to exclude African Americans whenever legislation permitted, by writing provisions that were racially laden. These were laws that prohibited blacks in certain jobs from starting unions, such as domestic workers and farmers. The second, that the administration of these laws be placed into the hands of the local officials. So if it was the South, the officials would be hostile towards black aspirations. And the third, prevented Congress from attaching any sort of anti-discrimination provisions to a wide array of social welfare programs. This provided white Americans with better social welfare and thus widening the gap between black and white America even further. Katz-Nielsen then transfers over to the 1944 election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and he mentions the black support of FDR. He states how W.E.B. Du Bois endorsed FDR as he had been the only president since Lincoln that had done anything to improve the black plight. Even though FDR tried to improve some conditions for African Americans, he was still limited in scope, as the poison of Jim Crow was already deeply entrenched within the federal government. With FDR being a Northern Democrat, he couldn't completely oppose the Southern Democrats as they controlled both houses of Congress. FDR's support from blacks stems back to the creation of the New Deal, mid-1930s. This government policy takes place to combat the rampant poverty caused by the Great Depression in 1929, and Katz-Nielsen describes the disparities between black and white poverty in the implementation of the New Deal, which gave social welfare to the poor, both black and white. However, due to local administrations located in the South, overseeing the distribution of federal grants to the poor, white families received disproportionate amounts of the federal grant money compared to poor black families. The social welfare benefits extended to people of old age, social assistance, and unemployment. Because the federal government was willing to yield to the whim of Southern Democrats on issues of race, civil rights, and regional prerogatives, it passed laws that allowed the creation of labor unions within the working sector, a topic that the Southern Democrats wanted to stay away from. Unions could establish minimum wages and a weekly limit of work hours. Southern Democrats could trade votes If the statutes enacted excluded farm and domestic workers, a workforce largely comprised of African Americans, from the protections that the laws granted. During and after World War II, Southern Democrats changed their views towards the union laws they helped enact because of the wartime reduction efforts. Blacks were entering industrial jobs and therefore gaining access to unions they previously did not have access to. Southern Democrats would switch and side with the Republicans and make union organization a more difficult process because they feared labor union organization would fuel civil rights activism. Katznelson mentions the Taft-Hartley Act extensively as it restricted the power and activities of labor unions by opposing free speech. President Truman would veto this bill numerous times, and it was referred to as the slave labor bill. As the racial discrimination heightened with the focus of the U.S. government attempting and succeeding with the subjugation of unions during and post-World War II, racial discrimination also plagued the United States military. All branches of the U.S. military were legally segregated due to Jim Crow. However, war was often used to alleviate the black plight to gain more citizenship and civil rights. During both World War I and World War II, blacks would enlist, fight in the name of freedom, but would return home and not receive the same freedom that they had fought for. So the blacks had the double V campaign, so victory abroad will lead to victory at home. Segregation within the U.S. military wouldn't legally end until 1948 under President Truman's Executive Order 9981. Until then, full military integration was challenged whenever it was brought up. The paradox of the U.S. Armed Forces fighting for world democracy was hypocrisy because it was undemocratic within itself. Blacks within the U.S. Armed Forces would be restricted to menial labor and often barred from participating in combat. They would be appointed to all black squadrons, battalions, and regiments led by white officers, and they were forced to use segregated, downtrodden facilities on military bases. During October 1940, President Roosevelt issued an approval that called for black enlisted personnel to be proportionally representative of the nation's population of blacks. It also allowed them access to different branches of the U.S. military and more training in fields that they were barred from. Prior to Roosevelt's approval, the U.S. Armed Forces was overwhelmingly white, and combined with the Selective Training and Service Act of 1940 allowed blacks to enlist en masse. However, blacks were accepted at lower rates than whites and often turned away due to illiteracy. The War Department would discriminate against illiterate blacks while accepting illiterate whites without question. Eventually, the U.S. Army would begin taking in black recruits to gain more manpower and, along with their training process, make them literate. Despite the segregation and racial discrimination within the U.S. Armed Forces, enlisting offered blacks opportunities they couldn't achieve prior to joining the military. Access to health care, decent shelter, payment, regular meals, opportunity to travel, training, and acquisition of a skill set for trade jobs, developing leader traits, and literacy. This increase in black literacy would serve as a decent foundation for the post-war civil rights movement. Katznelson then transfers to post-World War II by discussing the Selective Service Readjustment Act, or the GI Bill of Rights, and its involvement in the creation of the American middle class between 1944 and 1971. The GI Bill allowed a full generation of people to buy homes, attend higher education, start businesses, or find jobs that complemented their skill set. Katznelson mentions a speech given by President Clinton at Warm Springs, Georgia, where President Clinton reflects on the effectiveness and enduring legacy of the GI Bill and the American middle class it created. In Bill Clinton's own words, and I quote, "A true social revolution, the GI Bill raised the entire nation to a plateau of social welfare never before experienced in the U.S. history." Katznelson prompts the question if the entire nation. He then goes on to dispute the GI Bill didn't benefit blacks as much as it did whites. The GI Bill was at the time a New Deal era piece of legislation, which meant it fell under the same three mechanisms legislators used to write policies regarding social welfare. Although the GI Bill was race neutral, as it allowed any U.S. Armed Forces veteran to benefit from its doctrine, white veterans benefited the most. This process took place because of the decentralization of authority regarding the Veterans Administration. The VA was placed into the hands of local and state officials. Katz-Nielsen describes this process being highly evident within institutions of higher education and states several facts. Blacks couldn't attend white colleges, even though white colleges were in larger abundance. The lack of black colleges and their lack of quality compared to white colleges, and the lack of access for blacks in vocational education and on-the-job training. He analyzes the fact that blacks couldn't get employed within jobs that fit their skill set and were often devalued to menial labor jobs. And Katz-Nielsen then examines the fact that blacks were denied housing loans that the GI Bill promised because of openly racist reasons and being designated as high-risk candidates. Katz-Nielsen begins to conclude the book by examining President Johnson's original vision for affirmative action. Affirmative action was meant to be more grandiose than it currently is. It was supposed to influence the African American poor in the same ways the New Deal era social programs influenced whites. However, it instead became compensatory actions. Because affirmative action is looked upon as compensatory, it builds large amounts of opposition by people who support colorblind ideology. Some people view affirmative action as unconstitutional, as it can discriminate against people who aren't the minority, and that people should be based upon their own merits and race shouldn't be a factor. However, the opposition doesn't comprehend that affirmative action is an attempt to rectify the injustice that African Americans suffer from, and that affirmative action for whites existed before decades prior to affirmative action for blacks. Okay. The opposition tends to ignore the concept of white privilege and how being white led to better economic and social status. The policy of affirmative action can be controversial when cases are examined on a general sense and not on individual instances, and it has been challenged within the Supreme Court on numerous occasions. Katz-Nielsen describes Justice Lewis Powell's principle, which allow for affirmative action to take on the same type of ideal as Johnson's affirmative action. When the discrimination being remedied is specific, identifiable, and institutional. Katz-Nielsen ends the book by saying that affirmative action only compensates material injuries and that the psychological and metaphysical traumas can't be remedied. He states how the injustices enacted upon African Americans during the New Deal and the Fair Deal eras, and when affirmative action was white, needs to be constantly readdressed. The main strengths of the book is filled to the brim with information. It's factually dense. I learned a lot of information I did not know about the U.S. government's own involvement in the social and economic racial discrimination towards African Americans. The book is very thorough and presents its main argument in a logical and well-processed manner. 10/10, I would recommend this book over a well-written description on Amazon. And if people would like to learn the extensive history of affirmative action and the foundations of white privilege in the United States, and some of the weaknesses that I personally found, I felt like the pacing was off, as I had to double and triple read some sections to fully comprehend a few topics presented by the book. I found myself often Googling a few of the ideas, subjects, and people and policies to gain further understanding. And even though Katz-Nielsen didn't need to present white affirmative action prior to the 1930s, I felt as if he could have added a little bit of info, as white affirmative action has been around since the inception of our government. A few key examples are the 1790 Naturalization Act, the abolishment of European indentured servitude, and the universal white male suffrage in the 1830s. That's it.
Good stuff. All right. Questions for our presenter?
Lay it on me.
I'm kind of curious, does he ever get into explaining why the government pursued affirmative action but then failed to kind of actually benefit and help, the Black community? Like what was the motivation and why did they?
A lot of it has to do with the social climate during the 1960s and the civil rights movement. A lot of the civil rights movement basically was trying to gain equal rights for African Americans, and I think even though he doesn't explicitly explain why Johnson tried to pursue affirmative action, I think a lot of it has to do with helping them gain true equality that they didn't have prior to the Civil Rights Act? I can't remember
Rights
that.
Act, yeah.
Okay.
So Tobin, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think I remember reading things about how the Soviet Union used a lot of propaganda against the United States in the 60s, right around the Civil Rights era. Do you think that this could have been like in response to that propaganda, and that's why it hasn't really like fulfilled
This
its
being what?
purpose? Affirmative action.
I mean, Cold War dynamics have always been a part of the both analysis of and the way civil rights movement played itself out. I haven't ever seen an argument that the negative reaction to affirmative action is somehow related to those Cold War dynamics. It's an interesting query, but I think there's been enough political resistance inside the context of the United States that we didn't need an outside agitator for that to happen. Does that make sense?
Yeah. I think
Say more.
the argument that I've heard talks about how, like, yes, a lot of people in the United States were very much on board with civil rights, but people in the government, like public officials, weren't necessarily totally sold. And that, so
Oh.
I've heard that, like,
Yeah.
very much was due to Soviet Union, Russian, like, communists putting out propaganda saying, how can they say that they are an equal country when, you know, a good portion of their population is
Yeah.
Democrats.
Oh, absolutely. So Kennedy and Johnson administrations in particular felt that pressure. Now, there's other historians who have said that, well, there's just as many negative effects that came from that Cold War pressure because it also meant shutting out the more radical participants in civil rights movement. So people like Pauli Murray, just a host of other folks who earlier on had a much more robust economic agenda that affirmative action would be an attempt to address, were no longer valid. So Paul Robeson is kicked out. W. Du Bois is, persona non grata, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to hold both of those tensions together. Does that make sense?
Does Katz-Nielsen get at reparations at all as a whole, like not just affirmative action, but like the whole idea of reparations and what the future might be for that? Or
While reading this book, I don't recall at any moment him mentioning reparations. So. That's it.
Okay. Another round of applause for our presenter.